and that I've challenged myself deeply on for many, many years. I'm also really pleased to be on this panel with Jack Lieberman, whom I admire as a tireless social justice leader in Florida, and whose views I look forward to hearing and engaging with. I speak to you from my perspective as a white Jewish woman living in the United States who is a partner in the movement for justice in Palestine and Israel. I'm also deeply connected to my own people's history and grew up learning that never again, which was etched into our beings after the Holocaust, means never again for anyone. This evening we'll be discussing Israel and Palestine, and we'll be focusing on boycott, divestment, and sanctions, BDS, a global call from Palestinian civil society to hold Israel accountable to basic principles of human rights and international law, and to achieve freedom, equality, and justice. BDS is not a call that came about lightly. To the contrary, it is a call that grew out of decades of the Palestinian people being denied their basic human and national rights. Beginning before and then during Israel's creation in 1948, 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from their lands and homes. For Palestinians, this is known as the Nakba, meaning catastrophe in Arabic, which is responsible for Palestinians becoming refugees and being prevented from returning home. And the Nakba of 1948 didn't end. It continues to this very day as massive land theft, violence, and institutionalized discrimination have intensified at the hands of the Israeli government and military. The Israeli government's actions for decades have demonstrated a lack of genuine commitment to the rights of Palestinians. This is also true of its staunchest ally and supporter, the United States government, which funds Israel to the tune of well over $3 billion a year. Given this reality, Palestinian civil society, including grassroots and many other organizations, recognized that if they wanted freedom, they needed a citizens movement, a people's movement, to mobilize for their rights. And it was then when they called upon the global community to stand with them in their call for BDS and for justice. Initiated in 2005, the BDS movement was inspired by the boycott movement against South African apartheid. Boycotts have a long and honorable history and tradition as a strategy for overcoming injustice, and the Palestinian call for BDS is no different. Think of the Montgomery bus boycott in the U.S., as well as the Great Boycott. Once the injustice has been overcome, the boycott ends. Similarly, the boycott of Israel will end once it complies with international law. The Palestinian call for BDS includes freedom for Palestinians in the occupied territories, equality for Palestinian citizens of Israel, and justice for Palestinian refugees. Specifically, the three demands include: 1, ending the Israeli occupation, that is, the territories occupied by Israel in 1967, and dismantling the wall. 2, implementing full equality for Palestinians who live inside Israel. And 3, promoting the right of return for Palestinian refugees. And I'd like to discuss them one by one. The first demand, ending the Israeli occupation of 1967 and dismantling the so-called separation wall. Israel maintains a system of institutionalized discrimination against Palestinians in the occupied territories, that is in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. As documented in a report by Human Rights Watch, which makes similar observations as report after report by human rights agencies. And I quote, "Whether it's a child imprisoned by a military court or shot unjustifiably, or a house demolished for lack of an elusive permit, or checkpoints where only settlers are allowed to pass, few Palestinians have escaped serious rights abuses during this 50-year occupation," end quote. As supposed peace talks took place over the years, the reality on the ground was that the rate of settlement growth was staggering. Israel's massive expansion of settlements and expropriation of Palestinian land have eaten up much of the Palestinian people's land and destroyed any contiguous landmass. Close to 50,000 Palestinian homes and other structures have been destroyed by Israel in the occupied territories since the 1967 war. Approximately 650,000 Jewish Israeli settlers lived illegally on occupied Palestinian land in the West Bank and in Gaza. Palestinians in the West Bank are routinely denied their most basic human rights. They face hundreds of checkpoints where they're routinely humiliated and degraded, ongoing demolitions of their homes and uprooting of their olive trees, a segregated roadway system, that is, one for Israelis and one for Palestinians, arbitrary imprisonment, torture, and administrative detentions without trial or charge, and more. The Palestinians in Gaza live under constant siege, often lacking water, electricity, and the most basic of services. Gaza is often called the world's largest open-air prison. Israel controls the airspace, the water, commerce, and electricity supplies both in Gaza and the West Bank. Regarding the wall, Israel has built a wall which has drawn international condemnation that cuts through the West Bank and Jerusalem, dividing Palestinians from their land, from each other, separating families from one another, forcing Palestinians to go through checkpoints to get to work, and cutting off thousands of Palestinians from schools, from hospitals, and from social services. Israel calls it a separation wall. Palestinians and their supporters, myself included, call it a racial segregation or an apartheid wall. The second demand of the BDS call: implementing full equality for Palestinians who live inside Israel. Palestinians currently living in Israel, who make up close to 20% of the population, have faced great discrimination since Israel's inception and are increasingly subjected to racism and anti-democratic policies and legislation. There are over 65 Israeli laws that discriminate directly or indirectly against Palestinian citizens living in Israel or Palestinian residents of the occupied territories. These laws severely limit the basic rights of Palestinians in every area of life, including the right to land and housing, citizens' rights, education rights, language rights, religious rights, and more. Most recently, in 2018, Israel passed what's known as a nation-state law that claims only Jews have a right to self-determination in Israel, and it downgrades the status of the Arabic language. The nation-state law also says, with regard to the settlements in the occupied territories, which, as I mentioned, are generally recognized to be violations of international law, quote, the state views the development of Jewish settlement as a national value and will act to encourage and promote its establishment and its consolidation, unquote. And now for the third demand of the BDS call: promoting the right of return for Palestinian refugees. And I'd like to spend the most time on this demand because it's the one that I believe is most misunderstood and distorted, and which is essential for justice to be achieved. To fully appreciate this demand, I'd like to discuss a bit of Israeli history, beginning with Israel's creation and its relationship to the Nakba. One cannot speak about Zionism and Israel's creation without speaking about the Nakba. In fact, the Nakba is the legacy and clearest manifestation of Zionism. And what do I mean by that? Zionism began in the late 1800s. It refers to the political movement to create a Jewish homeland, a Jewish state, and which resulted in the creation of the State of Israel in the land of historic Palestine in May 1948. The Zionist myth was that Palestine was a land without people for a people without land. But in fact, there were hundreds and hundreds of thriving and culturally rich Palestinian cities and villages prior to the Nakba. While I had learned growing up that Zionism was the Jewish national liberation movement, what has been done to the Palestinian people in the name of Zionism was in fact a very different reality. As I learned more about the creation of Israel, I came to understand that my definition of Zionism had included only one part of a story and excluded the voices and history and experiences of those who had lived through the Nakba. I also came to the firm belief that liberation at the expense of another people, which was what Zionism had been, can never result in true liberation. Despite propaganda claiming that Palestinians left on their own accord or because they were instructed to do so by their leaders, the evidence points elsewhere. In fact, a Jewish majority state was created in Palestine because the Zionist movement purposefully reduced the numbers of the Palestinian people who were living there. In the process, vibrant Palestinian villages were destroyed and replaced with Jewish villages. The evidence of this intention is in a plan launched in March 1948, soon before Israel was declared a state, and it's known as Plan Dalet, carried out by the Haganah, the Zionist paramilitary, which later became the core of the Israeli Defense Forces. Plan Dalet laid out a blueprint in great detail for the destruction and forcible depopulation of Palestinian population centers. Included in the text of Plan Dalet, which is available for all to see, is the following, and I quote, "In the conquest of the villages in your area, you will determine whether to cleanse or destroy them," unquote. The question also arose what to do with the refugees. Should they be allowed to return when the war was over or not? Israel's founders left little doubt about the answer. The Israeli government on June 16th, 1948, said about the refugees, they're not returning. This decisions and measures to implement it to ensure that they wouldn't return is what would enable the establishment of a Jewish state with a large Jewish majority. Some who consider themselves Zionists or progressive Zionists acknowledge that the Palestinians suffered an injustice, even a grave injustice. But as awful as the Nakba was, they say, it was what had to be done. It was the price that had to be paid in order to create and secure the Jewish state. To be clear, the price was paid by the Palestinians. That is, Palestinians were expelled from their homes, their villages, and their land so that the Jewish state could be created. To me, the only way you can justify that kind of thinking that says the Nakba was the price that had to be paid is to believe that Jewish lives matter more than Palestinian lives. To understand the history of Israel's creation and the Nakba is to appreciate the central principle of the BDS campaign, namely that Palestinians have the right to return to their land from which they've been expelled and where they had been living for so long. The right of return for Palestinians is a right that is well established in international law. The first international source of support for Palestinian refugees' claims to a right of return is UN General Assembly Resolution 194 of December 1948, which said that, quote, refugees wishing to return to their homes and live at peace with their neighbors should be permitted to do so at the earliest practicable date, and that compensation should be paid for the property of those choosing not to return and for loss of or damage to property which under principles of international law or equity should be made good by the governments or authorities responsible, unquote. And in fact, Israel was accepted as a member of the United Nations in May 1949 only after it promised to fulfill this resolution. Aside from Resolution 194, the right of inhabitants to return to their homes from which they've been expelled by an occupying power is one of the fixed principles of international law. So I'd like to spend a few minutes discussing some of the accusations about BDS that we hear repeated from the Israeli government and some opponents of BDS, accusations that in truth are rooted in misinformation and propaganda. First is the highly irresponsible accusation that it is anti-Semitic to support BDS. It is not discriminatory in any way to hold a nation state accountable for its human rights abuses and for violations of international law. Israel has committed itself to principles of human rights under various human rights covenants, and like all countries that are party to those covenants, must be held accountable to that commitment. Israel should, of course, not be exempt from that commitment merely because it calls itself a Jewish state. But also, think about this. Why is it assumed that Palestinians and those standing for Palestinian rights hate Jews rather than being people who care about the Palestinian people, their well-being, and their right to live in dignity. I will also add that particularly at a time when white nationalist anti-Semitism is rising in this country, these false accusations of anti-Semitism do an injustice to the fight of actual anti-Semitism when it occurs. Second, opponents of BDS say that Israel's being singled out when there are so many countries who committed gross human rights violations. There has been a call from Palestinian civil society to join an international effort to hold Israel accountable to changing its behavior. That there are abuses in many countries across the globe is of course true. And if and when there are coordinated efforts by those impacted by those abuses, similar to the BDS call for Palestinians, many of us who care about justice, and clearly people in this room, would and do observe them. Those of us who support BDS do not say that Israel is the only human rights violator in the world. Of course not. And that is never the case with boycotts. The Great Boycott did not claim to be the only example in the US of the abuse of workers, but it was a coordinated grassroots effort to make change and for justice. So too with the Palestinian call for BDS. Also, many of us who are Jewish, like myself, feel compelled to speak out because the Israeli government claims to speak in our name. There are thousands upon thousands of us in Jewish communities who wish to make clear that Israel does not speak in our name and that its actions violate the values that we hold dear. And for those of us living in the US, there's a particular urgency to speak out because Israel is the largest recipient by far of US aid. So I, together with thousands upon thousands of others, wish to make clear that we vehemently oppose US funding of the Israeli government's human rights abuses. And one of the ways we do this is by standing firm with the Palestinian call for justice. Again, BDS is not a call for a permanent boycott of Israel. It's a call only until Israel complies with basic principles of international law and human rights. BDS does not target individuals, but rather institutions and corporations that are complicit in Israel's systematic violations of Palestinian human rights. BDS is not a call to deny anyone of their rights. It is a vision and a call affirmatively for equal rights, freedom, and dignity for all those living in Palestine and Israel. And it's about building an equitable society that's not rooted in a relationship of occupier and occupied, or in anyone living as second-class citizens. So for all these reasons and more, as a Jew and as a human being committed to justice, and as someone who has cared deeply about this issue for just about 45 years, I support and embrace the ethical, necessary, and yes, dignified call for BDS. And on a final and personal note, I have always felt, and I continue to feel, deeply connected to my own community's history of struggle and resistance, of the anti-Semitism and oppression we've endured. In no way is my support for BDS and my deep commitment to justice for Palestinians at odds with that connection to my people. In fact, it grows out of my history and life as a Jewish person who grew up learning from my deeply ethical parents to be proud of who I was, but to never think I was better than anyone else or any other people, and to fight against injustice whenever and wherever I saw it. Therefore, I, together with so many others across the globe, will continue to support and honor the Palestinian call for BDS until there is a just solution rooted in ending state policies that are discriminatory and anti-democratic, and ensuring equal rights and respect and safety for all. Thank you.